Okay, the last panel of the day is going to be titled Nist 800-171, Is the Government Paving the Way for Commercial Security? And on the panel members, we have Tom Finan, who's a practice leader with Willis Towers Watson. He previously served as the Chief Strategy Officer at ARC Network Security Solutions. And prior to ARC, he served as a Senior Cybersecurity Strategist and Counsel with the Department of Homeland Security's National Protection and Programs Directorate. We also have, you can come on up after I read your name. We also have Kelly Hood, who's a cybersecurity engineer at G2, where she supports federal and commercial clients to improve and implement security standards such as the Nist framework for improving critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. We have Emile, Monette, who serves as, all right, if you're going to go, who serves as Senior Cybersecurity Strategist and Acquisition Advisor in the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications at DHS. And he has a unique experience with cybersecurity and procurement in the executive and legislative branches of the federal government, including service as a senior advisor in the Executive Office of the President, professional staff member with the House of Representatives Oversight Committee, and as an active duty Air Force officer. Vijay Takanti is the Senior Vice President of Product Development at Exostar, where he led the development of the company's risk management solution that allows clients to assess the cybersecurity maturity of their global multi-tier supply chains. And today's moderator is Don Ulsch, who's a senior consultant in cybercrime at the litigations consulting firm of Charles Rivers Associates and serves on the board of Cyber Research Institute at Mercy College. Don, over to you.
Welcome, everyone. So this, the panel is, the question we're addressing is government paving the way for commercial security. I've been in the security business for many decades, and I would have to say that in general, government has led in security, but we're going to discuss specifically the issue of cyber and information security in 800-171. But you've heard just a very brief introduction. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give us just a little bit more detail about their backgrounds and qualifications for being on this panel. We'll start with Tom.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Finan. I recently joined Willis Towers Watson after working at a compliance-oriented technology company in Dulles known as ARC. But previously, I worked for about 7 years at the Department of Homeland Security on the topic of cybersecurity insurance and cyber risk management, and how do you incentivize better security through market-based incentives.
Hi, everyone. Emile Monette. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security and the Chief Information Security Officer's Office. My focus, most of my work is in supply chain risk management. So the Nist Special Publication 171 is pretty core to some of the things that I do, and I'm pleased to be here to talk to you about it.
Hi, Vijay Takanti. I'm from Exostar. We primarily are in the supply chain in aerospace defense. Aerospace defense being companies like Boeing and Lockheed. Obviously, these companies have to comply with 800-171, as well as ensure that their supply chain is compliant. So that's where I spend most of my time nowadays.
Hi, my name is Kelly Hood. I work for G2. We do a lot of government and commercial support. We also have been working with Nist and helping to develop the Cybersecurity Framework, or they helped to develop and now updating the Cybersecurity Framework and also some of the other Nist publications. So I've also been involved in helping my organization with the 171 implementation, and so that's.
Yeah, and in my last role, I was the senior managing director at PricewaterhouseCoopers in charge of cybercrime and cybercrime investigations. And I've written a couple of books on the subject, the last of which is called Cyber Threat, published by John Wiley and Sons. I want to start with this question. What's the right balance between government and industry on these issues? And I ask the question because when we talk about government, we can talk about defense, we can talk about regulators and law enforcement all being part of the government. So there are different aspects of government where there may be differing opinions on what that right balance is in terms of influence. And let me start with Tom, and then any of the other panelists can feel free to participate in the question?
Sure, and I think it's a very important question because I think the answer often depends upon what agency you're talking about. The Department of Homeland Security literally has almost no regulatory authority, and I think what the benefit, a lot of people bemoan that sometimes, but I think the benefit of being that kind of agency is that the good that government can do can be done a lot more easily. You can convene conversations, you can have discussions about cyber risk, cyber incidents, and it's not going to come back and bite you. What we heard through the course of the workshops that we held on cyber risk management, including insurance, was from the private sector, critical infrastructure owners and others, who would come in and say, well, I'm glad I can have this conversation here because I can't have this discussion with law enforcement. I'm afraid that they'll use this. They'll pass it on to DOJ or the SEC or somebody else. And so I think that first and foremost, government should be striving to create a safe space to have conversation, and that convening power, getting people to the table, and some sort of assurance that it's not going to turn into a regulation that will haunt them for being honest and trying to do the right thing. But it's a challenge because you're struggling with wanting to advance security, but at the same time you've got agencies with different missions that are charged with regulating and fining and penalizing companies that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So it's an ongoing conversation and a challenging one.
So Tom, quick question. You talk about an interesting concept here of a safe space. Is there that safe space now?
I think there is a safe space, and I'm a particular fan of the Department of Homeland Security because I worked there for so long. But there are some legal authorities that allow companies to come in and have a frank discussion anonymously. So I think it exists, but I think not as many folks are aware of it as they should be. But each of the sector coordinating councils and a lot of folks in private industry know about it. I just think it's a tool that DHS and frankly other agencies that have a Homeland Security related mission could be using.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I can kind of jump in there too. I think what you said at the beginning there is really critical. It's a matter of what mission the government is trying to accomplish, really, in terms of whether the government should lead or industry should lead. I think in general, the government would prefer to rely upon commercial best practice if that is sufficient in the particular space that you're talking about, where that mission is. But if you've got a high assurance need mission, in general, IT security practices across the board in commercial IT may not meet that security need, and that's where the government does need to step in and provide some extra sort of over and above requirements, if you will.
So there's a lot of discussion, certainly on the private side, about the public-private initiatives. And you were just talking about this, Tom, that not a lot of people know about it. So there are a lot of United States attorneys on the FBI who are running similar programs, but again, very very underrepresented, not talked about very much. But the public-private initiative, I think, is very important, just in order to understand what is the role of government, what is the role of private industry, what can be shared and what cannot be shared. Vijay, I'm going to ask you this question. All right, you wanted to comment on this? All right. How comprehensive is 800-171 in your view?
Well, 800-171 is derived from Nist 800-53 and specifically deals with information that is labeled by the federal government as CUI, right? And in addition, it deals with non-federal systems storing CUI information, and CUI is defined by the agencies. So given the fact that CUI needs to be protected, and it is the federal agencies mandated by FISMA to protect it, the question is how does a non-federal agency, which is not under FISMA, protect that information? That's the genesis of NIST 800-171. I think the framework itself was limited to ensure that it's a compliance framework more than a cybersecurity framework. But the intent of the NIST, and specifically DoD, which is actually mandated through a DFAR, that supply chain that supplies to DoD, which has information which is labeled, in the case of DoD, something called CDI, Covered Defense Information, that supply chain has to comply with Nist 800-171 by December 31st of this year. This is only specific to DoD supply chain. Even that has proven challenging for the private sector. I mean, there's a lot of talk of meeting cybersecurity requirements, but what we're finding is the private sector in general is not clear where to make their investment when it comes to cybersecurity, right? There are, if you look at 800-53, there are 300 plus controls. And as a small company, especially in the DoD supply chain, there are many small companies, have a limited budget. Where should I invest? What is the priority? I think 800-171 has given them that list of priorities, has given them the direction in terms of specifying a mandate, but also has given a specific, I would suggest, a roadmap. For example, one of the controls talks about having a plan, and the plan needs to show when that company will be compliant, not necessarily compliant by December 31st, but have a plan to be compliant. So in that sense, I think it is the first step in cybersecurity, not the only step, but it's a very good beginning from what we are seeing in the government.
All right, so my next question is for you and Kelly, and then Emile and Tom should feel free to jump in. There's always an issue, in this case, government leading by providing the framework. So when the government provides the framework and industry integrates or implements the framework, there's always a risk of a sort of a checkbox mentality. Did you do this? Did you do that? How do we avoid that in this case? How do we avoid the risk of just checking the box in terms of implementing 800-171?
I think one of the most important things is just to have that conversation. I think having this DFAR come out to force these requirements has shown that a lot of people maybe hadn't thought through all of these requirements and how they were protecting their data. And so I think that it's forcing that information. And as long as people are having those conversations, looking at the risk to their organization, trying to actually, make not just check the box, but having the conversations within their organization would be a huge step.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it depends on how you approach the problem. Do you approach it as a compliance problem, which will be checking the box, or do you want to approach the problem as improving the cybersecurity? I think many of the organizations we are dealing with are taking the approach that this is given them a business driver to go and justify to their board of directors or their CEO to help them justify their investment in enhancing security. I think that's the right approach. If you take the approach of compliance, you're not really improving cybersecurity. At your point, I can write a SSP and show to the agency when I'll be meeting that, and that could be 3 years from now. So I'm defeating the purpose of the entire cybersecurity improvement plan, which 800-171 is geared to do.
All right, but Vijay, when you mention the word compliance, the next word is usually enforcement. Is this something that A, should be enforced? Is it enforceable? Who enforces it?
Good question. I think it all depends on the agencies, as Emile just mentioned. In the case of DoD, they've defined it's part of a contractual obligation. Given that it's a part of a DFAR and a contractual obligation, at the end of the day, the contract is enforced. And in the case of DoD, they do have audit agencies like DMDC who are authorized to verify those DFAR clauses. DoD has specified certain guidelines for DMDC, for example, or DCA auditors to come and verify not all the artifacts that are required for compliance, but some of the artifacts. For example, is there a compliance, the SSP in place? These suppliers have to purchase a certificate, for example, to report incidents. Do they have the certificate to actually report incidents? So there are certain elements to verify that these entities are taking it seriously. Now, in terms of, there's no concept of enforcement I've heard yet from the agencies, but who knows?
I think it's important to keep your eyes on the prize. 800-171, I agree, is very thorough. And I'm a huge fan of standards. I think whenever you have a group of experts, usually from around the world, coming together, putting together ideas for security, that's a great thing. But the challenge is that I'm seeing specifically with 800-171 compliance, and I have some I saw it myself in my prior position, but I'm seeing it even now. Many companies are just waking up to the fact that they have to comply by December 31st of this year. And it is, I think, posing a potential risk of a check-the-box kind of situation. And I'm afraid that instead of focusing on security, which is the prize, they're focusing on, all right, let me just do this so I can continue doing business with DoD. And I think DoD's intentions are great. They want people to be focusing on security because that's the whole purpose, and there's a lot of CUI out there. But I'm afraid it might become a race to the bottom just to meet a calendar deadline. And the broader point, which I'm sure Nist would support, is that this is a stepping stone toward greater security. I mean, to truly come into compliance with any sort of framework or standard, it can take a lot of money and a lot of time, and I'm just not seeing that. And I hope that what DoD and other agencies will do is sort of encourage companies that this isn't the beginning, middle, and end of the conversation. Show us that you're at least trying to comply, and tell us what that compliance looks like, because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. And what might be right for a small 25-person company in terms of meeting the obligations of 171 or being more secure is going to look very different than a large corporation. So I'm hoping that this is just the beginning of a conversation that DoD is going to be having, and it doesn't get relegated to what most compliance steps look like or compliance situations turn out to be.
If I can just add a couple
sure.
things here, Don. So one of the core distinctions and something that's unique about 800-171 is that it is written for non-federal systems. Most of the 800 series, like all of them except for 171 pretty much, are written for federal systems. So it's unique in that way. The other thing that's unique about it, and it kind of flows from that being written for non-federal systems, is that if we talk about information security in federal systems, we're talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. 171 is only focused on confidentiality. Some of that bleeds into integrity because the controls that are for confidentiality also affect integrity, but for the most part, it is really only focused on confidentiality. Some of the things that we're grappling with in DHS right now are around what is that distinction of a federal system versus a non-federal system. And when you as a contractor or a non-federal entity are operating a system on behalf of the government, we at DHS are calling that a federal system going forward. In the past, that may not have been the case. And so you may have a service that you're providing to the government, that you're operating a system that is handling some form of information, federal information. And you come to your option exercise or you come to a recompete, and all of a sudden you've got this new requirement in your contract that says, hey, you not only have to meet confidentiality, maybe vis-a-vis 171, maybe not, but you also have to meet integrity and you have to meet availability controls. And those might be a significant uptick in your investment as a provider.
Yeah, I agree with Emile. Another thing unique about 800-171 is 800-171 also has defined the risk profile. The risk profile that defined is moderate, right? 800-53 allows you multiple risk profiles, low, moderate, and high, whereas 171 has defined the risk profile that you have to meet from a control perspective is moderate. So that's very important to understand. The other thing is, given that, to Emile's point, 800-171 is only focused on confidentiality, DoD has actually specified through an FAQ a lot of other requirements, especially when it comes to dealing with service providers. I'm a supply chain company. I'm manufacturing in aerospace defense some component for avionics component for a defense company. I don't have an IT shop. I use an IT service from a provider like Amazon or somebody else. In those instances where we're using a cloud service, DoD has specified that the requirements go beyond 800-171, and they actually have to comply with the FedRAMP moderate equivalent standard. They have not defined what equivalent means, so that is up to some.
Well, that's up to you as the provider, right? You can propose, okay, if you're not FedRAMP certified and you don't have an ATO, you can propose, okay, here's my equivalencies, and there are some mappings out there that provide equivalencies from the Nist guidance in 800-53, which maps through to 171, and the ISO standards, for example.
All right, so this is a good point. Let me just be the devil's advocate for a minute. I'm the head of compliance. I get the significance. I can appreciate the significance. But there's also this thing called compliance fatigue, right? How much do we have to be responsible for complying with? So in the case of 800-171, how does that map to other things like the SEC's 2011 Cybersecurity Risk Guidance? How does it map to ISO, the Nist framework? How much additional work does this really represent, or does it really represent not much more additional work, just sort of a reconfiguration of the way that things have been? And then that raises the question, is it then that important?
It depends.
Yeah, it depends, and it also depends on
You should get a consulting. Yeah.
It also depends on, if you look at whether ISO or 800-53, which are almost similar, the very first is, and even NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the very first determination you have to make is what is the risk profile, right? Now, 800-171 has taken that parameter out of the equation by defining the risk profile is moderate. Second thing, they've defined specific, they've been very prescriptive. For example, one of the controls says, if you are a privileged user, if you're accessing a system, both local access and network access has to be protected by multi-factor authentication. So they've gone to that level of detail. So in a sense, it's prescriptive, and it's challenging to meet some of these local access. For example, I'm doing some work on a firewall, I have to have a two-factor authentication because I'm a privileged user, I'm a system administrator. So that makes it very challenging in some cases. But if you are a great follower of ISO or 800-53, you have a practice in place, it would definitely work. But to Tom's point, what we're finding out is in many companies, they've taken a very different approach, right? Because the way they classify risk is different, and that is a rub.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in on the multi-factor authentication issue. It's one of those instances where the government has seen if you're not using multi-factor authentication, you are at a much higher risk of an incident. And we've seen time and time again where that's been a vector for attacks, for successful attacks. And so, you know, looking at industry and doing some surveys of industry, the federal contractor base, we found that, you know, about 40% of survey respondents that were federal contractors actually were using multi-factor authentication either for their own networks or for access for their suppliers to get into their networks. Mm-hmm. And so that requirement, that hard requirement in 171 is a response to that.
I completely agree. DoD actually, in one of their industry days, pointed out 80% of cyber incidents, the root cause is weak identity management. 80%.
So pursuant to this whole issue of the compliance fatigue, does it make sense, in your opinions, to take 800-171 and to utilize that within the various regulators now, Federal Trade Commission, Health and Human Services, Securities Exchange Commission, to use that as sort of a foundation in those regulatory environments? Does that make sense?
Even in the context of DoD, 800-171 is one more addition. There are lots of other deep flow-down conditions made in America or right. So to your point about fatigue, there's a lot of that. And what we're finding out, a couple of things. One is the supply chain is not aware of this requirement. Sometimes they're finding out, because they just accept a contract. They definitely don't read the fine print. And second, even if they read the fine print, to Tom's point, they may be taking a position we will show compliance when it is required to be shown, right, as opposed to acting on it.
So I think there's an impulse to use things like 800-171 as a proxy for the standard of due care for fiduciary duty, and I understand that, but that standard is pretty soft right now, and that's why I say soft. It's malleable. It's changing, right? It's kind of creeping upward, and maybe we are at a place where something like 800-171 is that minimum standard of due care that a fiduciary owes to a company. But I don't know that we're there yet.
And I worry about that a little bit. I mean, the genius of the Nist cybersecurity framework is that it is so flexible. And to the point raised earlier, you can choose what level you want to be at, and then there's a whole range of controls that you can adopt and apply to yourself and actually be effectively using the Nist framework. I think that when regulators move in for the action, I think they're looking for like a simple, if this standard, if we make this essentially a standard, we're going to be in good shape. But the nature of cyber risk, because it evolves so quickly, the general direction that something like 800-171 points out, I think is the right thing. But the controls, whether they're human-based or technical or process-based, are going to change and evolve over time. And so my worry would be that if you're a regulatory agency and you're using something like 800-171 as a benchmark, if some company out there is doing something different, but it is not within the knowledge base of the regulating community or the staff, are you going to get a penalty because you're not doing it like everybody else? Maybe you're going to be penalized because you're a company that's leaning in and is being more innovative. So I saw this sort of happen with some of the insurance underwriters out there, where they were very into PCI as a standard, and they would ask, are you using PCI DSS? And they didn't really go much further than that. And if you answered no, that was not a good thing for you on an underwriting application. But the reason they didn't ask anything else is that they realized pretty quickly that how someone might be implementing that particular standard may be different and completely appropriate. And it's a hard benchmark. It's too much of a gray line. So I like the genius of Nist and emphasizing the voluntary and calling it a framework and not a standard, because it's got to be an ongoing, flexible conversation, because that's just the nature of the risk and the nature of the organizations that are going to ultimately be utilizing it. It can't be black or white.
Tom, I agree with you completely, but what we're noticing is, although there's a lot of talk of improving cybersecurity, as you go down the supply chain, when I say go down the supply chain, as the size of the company becomes smaller and smaller, these companies, when it comes to investment, they tend to make investments on keeping their business going and not necessarily cybersecurity. And I believe that has led DoD to re-examine, and not just DoD. What we're noticing is the primes, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, or the Boeings, they're also beginning to see that a lot of intellectual property, a lot of loss of at the end of the day, affecting national security. So I believe they came to the conclusion, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, to have a compliance regime is better than having nothing at all, and specifying a set of controls. Now, Nist and DoD both do, they do specify that you have to comply, but they also, if you show equivalent methods to how you meet the control. For example, one of the things we have been discussing with the DoD community is, although you don't specify, you specify access to network as a control. What about access to the information? At the end of the day, you're trying to protect information, and access to information can be using different types of technologies like digital rights management as opposed to network access. And DoD is open to those concepts. They're not suggesting, they're saying this is the minimum set of standards you should meet, but if you can show us better ways to do this, right?
Kelly, I'm sorry. Kelly, you were jumping in on the cover.
I would say that I think some of the benefit is having that flexibility, because you want this common set of requirements that everyone needs to implement, but everyone can't implement them in the same way. Like you were saying with the smaller businesses, it's just, they can't implement it at the same level as a larger defense contractor, but you do what makes sense for your organization. And that's what I was saying earlier about having that conversation, deciding what your risk is, what kind of information you have, and how best to do that. If you're going to control all of your data, if the contractor you work for is going to hold that data for you, you can have those conversations, decide who's going to hold that and take on that risk, who's going to have the responsibility of handling that. And I like that NIST 171 gives you the flexibility to make those decisions rather than forcing it out as technology and companies change over time. It's not saying that everyone has to do it in a particular way. it's a requirements, but it's still flexible in how you would implement the requirements.
I agree. One of the biggest challenges we're seeing with Nist or any cyber framework is companies are not, they're not sure where the data is, right? That's the basic problem. If I don't know where my data is, I don't know how to protect it. It doesn't matter the Nist 171 or ISO, whatever. So the challenge for many of these companies is data information discovery. Where is that information? And is that information labeled CDI or CUI? And is that information isolated to a system? Is it all over the system? That is the fundamental problem of cybersecurity, right?
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think it's great if it starts a conversation, but as long as it allows for that flexibility of response, and I think DoD gets that. But to your question about, you know, the SEC or somebody else, they may not, because their cybersecurity is not really their gig, they may not understand that the value in something like an 800-171 is the fact that different organizations are going to implement it differently. And I wouldn't want to see companies penalized because they choose to do something that's different that may be just as good as what another company has chosen to do, but because of the lack of awareness, they don't use it the right way.
So this is an interesting point. You say the SEC may not actually grasp the significance of 800-171, but many of the contractors are going to be publicly traded companies that will be SEC registrars, therefore they're going to have to become aware of it. Is that an opportunity for the government to lead in this area?
Well, I think I don't know whether the government to lead or as a partnership. And for example, a lot of work is being done, led by DHS primarily, in terms of collaboration. I mean, they have in industry sector ISACs, Information Security Analysis Centers. You have an ISAC, you have multiple ISACs in the DoD sector, more classified and unclassified. You have an ISAC in healthcare, you have an ISAC. So there's a lot of work, at least in the US, the federal government is doing. And this cybersecurity is not a national issue, right? If I'm a multinational company, and what we're noticing is, in the US, it's NIST 800-171, I cross the Atlantic, in the UK, it is Cyber Essentials, I go to Australia, it is SANS 20. So you are faced with this multi-regime across the geography, and you have to figure out how, as a multinational company, you will comply or you will meet those requirements. So that we are seeing those challenges for those large public companies as they cross the boundaries.
So, Tom, next question, I want to start with you because of your background. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of market activity around cyber insurance. So it's on everybody's mind. I've had conversations with clients about how do they know how much insurance they need, what's the cost of a data breach. Insurers are changing the actual language in cyber insurance policies on the basis of what's happening in the news every day and according to what the ramifications are of the latest breaches. If you're in cyber insurance, what do you need to focus on with regard to 800-171? Do you see that as an asset? Is it something that you would want companies to adopt? Do you think it will actually offset cyber risk to the extent that it should be of interest to cyber insurers?
I think it certainly could be, and I'm only 8 days into the job. But what I think is that most underwriters are really looking to see what is the maturity of an organization. How are they thinking about their cyber risk? Do they understand what assets are actually in potential jeopardy from either an intentional or negligent act? So I mentioned earlier that on a lot of underwriting applications that I saw a few years ago, people were asking about PCI DSS. Is it possible that 800-171 might be something that they ask about? Well, if your major client is DoD or another defense subcontractor, then they may want to know that. But I don't think necessarily that they'll have the expertise to understand whether or not the particular array of controls that you have indicates that you are effectively implementing 800-171. But if they discover during the interview process and the application process that because of the nature of your business, this is something that you're taking seriously, it's one of many factors that they're going to be looking at, and it's going to be an indicator, I think, certainly an organization that is thinking proactively about the risk, it's sort of amazing how many companies are not. But it is actually probably, it counts in their favor if they, A, are aware of the standard, and that assumes the underwriter is aware of it as well, and that you're able to tell a good risk management story based upon the actions that you're taking. A lot of underwriting is an art, not a science. They're looking to see, how are you approaching the risk? How are you thinking about it? Is it an enterprise approach? Is it just a checkboxing approach? So I think it could be a valuable factor for companies that are servicing DoD, but it's probably a new concept, frankly, to the insurance industry as well, because it's not as well known as the framework or even 853.
Yeah, I mean, I would advocate for something more holistic than 171 being used by the insurance industry. Something like the Cybersecurity Framework, because it does assess a more comprehensive view of the organization from a process perspective.
Yeah, and I think what's nice about 800-171 is that it draws upon the Nist framework. I think that's sort of like inherent in it. And underwriters do ask about they shouldn't say compliance, but use of the framework. I think 800-171, to your point earlier, is that DoD felt it needed something more directive and more explanatory. The question after the NIST framework came out was, well, how do I implement this? I think 800-171 in many ways is a way to answer that question for companies in the defense industrial base.
Yeah, I think I agree. And especially we'll have to see 800-171 has a context, and the context is protecting CUI, right? It is not protecting any other sensitive information. It's up to the entity to make that risk decision, whether it's moderate or high. So I'm not sure you want to use 800-171. It's a good blueprint to be used. Obviously, I think sets the bar a little high, but it depends on how you're actually protecting your information systems. And not all of your information system will be having CDI, so they don't need to be protected at the same level. So I agree with both Emile and Tom. I mean, you need to look at a different framework, whether it's a Nist cybersecurity framework or so cybersecurity framework lets you use other controls like COBIT or 800-53 or ISO to make your determination what is that set of comprehensive security policy that you have as an enterprise and where do you want to implement it. And lastly, I mean, cybersecurity, as Tom mentioned, it is an ever-changing landscape. You may be good today, you may not be good tomorrow because the threat landscape has changed. It's an asymmetric landscape. It keeps changing. So it's very difficult unless you have a continuous evaluation of that. And 800-171, at least there's nothing of that nature in 800-171, how continuous evaluation has to be done. Whereas the NIST cybersecurity framework has those 5 different stages which lets you do that. So I think
Functions.
Functions.
Yeah, I want to ask one more question, and then I want to turn to the audience for any questions that you may have. So my question has to do around the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that's sweeping Europe and now the United States for U.S. companies. So as we talk about sort of the larger government contractors, which are, say, publicly traded, have many probably doing 60% of their business internationally, are there elements of 800-171 that from a compliance director's point of view that can be used to substantiate or further develop the cyber defenses that are critical to the GDPR?
Well, my answer is easy because I don't know. We will see. We're kind of watching, and we know that it's going to have an impact on our contractor base, but we're sort of holding off to see what that impact is from that commercial sector.
Well, GDPR is about privacy, and we tend to think privacy and security go hand in hand, but in some cases, privacy and security do collide, especially when it comes to anonymity. From a privacy perspective, especially GDPR, you want to have anonymity. From a security perspective, we want to audit trails and know who did what and when. So you will see those collisions, and as Emile said, all of us are examining GDPR. How do we actually manage it while trying to meet the security requirements? And
Of course, there is no privacy without security.
it's true, you could have that too.
Yeah.
Or security without privacy.
Right, so just to add on to that, I think there will be cases where there's some overlap there, but it's not going to be, comprehensive way to implement or GDPR to meet those requirements.
Right.
So I would agree with everyone else.
Okay. Audience, any questions of the panel? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I think I'll address this primarily to Tom, but if the other panelists have a comment on this. You were talking up the cybersecurity framework, and it's a good idea because you can sort of pick how deep or mature you want to go in each of these areas. And I agree with you. It's very good. And if you and I, or you're going to assess me to underwrite me, we agree on the description of the terms. If we talk about physical security, we mean the same thing. So you can tell if I got my head on straight. But I'm willing to bet if you're going to come look for me when I put in a claim, it's going to be more the rubber meets the road. So you're going to want something that's prescriptive, like controls, whether it's the 171 for the CUI or the full tilt Nist 853. Have you considered that as, the description is the CSF, but the currency is these controls, and that's how you're going to pay me my claim?
Yeah, I think you raise a really great point, because the cybersecurity framework, everyone sort of bought into it because in many ways it was not prescriptive at all. It's a roadmap, and I think people touted it especially because it was a way to have a common taxonomy, to talk about cyber risk, to think about it as a continuum process. But you're right. I mean, if you're making business decisions, you want to be able to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. I think the challenge for the insurance industry is that, okay, if you want to be in an apples to apples situation, that's fine. It just can't be a static inquiry, because as the risk evolves and as controls evolve, again, whether they're technical or human-based or whatever it may be, I think it's going to require underwriters to be much more dynamic in what they do. And sure, they can ask about the framework, but what effective use of the framework means may shift rather rapidly. And I think that means that there's going to be some changes in the insurance industry. I don't think you're going to be looking at a once or twice a year renewal. I think you have to be in a constant risk management dialogue with your clients. And if the underwriting community concludes that effective use of the Nist framework and the various standards that are included within it means XYZ, you're probably going to have to give your clients a heads up so they can adapt and sort of strategize with you about how they go about using it. But I think it's a really valuable point. We can't be in loosey-goosey land. We have to have something concrete that people can be striving toward. And I think, frankly, the insurance industry is likely going to be the market influence that does that. That means changes in how people are managing risk. It means changes in how insurance is underwritten and renewed.
Do you think, Tom, that as a result of that this should be a discussion point in the intake process between the insurer, the broker, and the insured policyholder?
Oh, I do. I think if your answer to an underwriter's question about do you use the framework is no, you're probably not likely to get coverage in the amounts that you're looking for, if at all. I think, though, that because the insurance industry is moving so directly into this space, it's necessarily going to require different skills and talents and understandings that traditional underwriters may not have. And that means hiring people who have some cybersecurity and broader risk management background and understanding so they can have that ongoing dialogue. I mean, insurance is a business proposition. And yes, it's an important part of an overall risk management program, but the goal of the underwriter and the broker should be to put the client in the best position possible or help them be in the best position possible so they either don't have a breach or if they do, that its effects are minimized. And I think that I think the distance between risk mitigation and risk transfer through insurance is much smaller in the insurance arena, and I think that calls for dialogue that is constant And it means that you have to educate your clients that they have to be open to doing new and different things to maintain coverage. And I think it means some internal conversations across the insurance industry about how do we staff with talent and skills and know-how to respond to a dynamically changing risk.
And I think as part of that, it's important to be able to articulate, on behalf of the insured policyholders, to articulate what they think their risk is and why. And to date, I've not really seen that as effectively as I might like to.
Yeah, and I think everybody's struggling with that, frankly.
Yeah.
I think as more and more people become aware of the risk and accept that they actually are at risk, my hope is that there will be ranges of motion that are determined, right? You know, what is an appropriate control to have given what my assets are and where the threat landscape seems to be going. But again, it can't be static, and it means that both sides, the customer and the provider of an insurance policy, is going to have to be open to some experimentation and also be open to change, and sometimes rapid change, and still make it an attractive business proposition to purchase the product.
Any other questions? I think there was another question out there. Yes.
Bill Rice with Raytheon. Worked with a number of defer customers looking at the 800-171 categories, and many of them are binary. You know, do you have the security setting, do you not? The policy and procedure part tends to be the ones that most of these organizations stumble with because they're not sure. Do you have any thoughts on what the government, commerce, or company relationship can be around making that easier for them so that maybe example policies or guidelines on policies that could help them get that done more quickly?
Actually, Nist has published a set of documents to support 800-171. For example, they have a template on the SSP, the security plan. They have also provided tools, so you can actually use the tools to provide information to generate the cybersecurity, the SSP, not cybersecurity plan, the SSP itself. So, and DoD has added to that list of tools to be used by organizations, right? So we are seeing that DoD's and Nist are actually investing a lot to ensure, at the end of the day, it's not about compliance, it's about improving cybersecurity. And to do that, it's better to give tools as opposed to just say these are the compliance rules you have to meet with.
Go ahead, Emile.
I was going to say, seek and engage in that dialogue with your contracting officer, with your program manager, with your government counterpart, because you know those equivalencies to the controls and the way that you meet adequate security, which is really the underpinning of 171, will change over time. To Tom's point, and is dynamic. So, you know, us in the government are not necessarily always going to be the most up to speed on, you know, the latest way to get us to adequate security. And so, you know, if you guys and if you're in you know, a supply chain for Raytheon or somebody else, you know, you probably have, you know, some innovative ways to get us to adequate security. And my understanding of DoD's position in this space is that they're willing to listen to that. Your plan of action and milestone that you submit with your SSP is intended to create that dialogue.
And I agree. These are important tools that should be looked at. I would only caution that, you know, they are tools, and if we look at another aspect of this, it's very dynamic. And so we should also be looking at, you know, the fact that threat, risk, impact, and probability are not necessarily going to be consistent across all companies. And so, you know, one of the themes today is make this cyber risk sensitive, you know, base these programs around security on a risk basis. So what is the risk? So tools are great, absolutely believe in them, but we just need to look at it from a risk-based point of view to make sure that these are the right tools to be used at the right time. And one of the variables might be even companies in the same industry may not actually have operations, let's say, in the same countries internationally, which may impact the actual risk. So taking that into consideration is not only a good way of doing business, it's also a compliance and a risk management issue. Any other questions?
Why is the light flashing behind you?
Okay, in that case, we've just been informed there will be no more questions. All right, thank you very much.
Don, and thanks to the panel for those great insights. I'd like to give a special thanks to all the exhibitors, sponsors, speakers, and panelists today, and all of you for attending. Mark your calendars for 2018. So November 13th, 2018 will be next year's Capital Cybersecurity Summit, where we'll be featuring keynotes, or a keynote from Mark McLaughlin, the CEO of Palo Alto Networks. Thanks again, and have a great evening.